Prior to working with macros or code in Excel or any other program, it's always important to check your security levels. When checking security levels, we need to make sure that we leave it as high as we can while still functioning. Now in 2007, you will notice that the macro security is right off the developer toolbar. In prior versions, you'll need to first go to the Tools menu, then to Macros, and finally to Security. In 2007, you'll notice macro security right on the top of my screen. Notice I have 4 options: disable without notification, with notification, except when digitally signed, and enable all. It is never recommended to do enable all. This can run very dangerous code without warning you of it whatsoever. Before we talk about the settings right in 2007, let's go back to some of the screens in 2003. One advantage of 2003 is that they explain the settings to us. You will notice once again 4 levels of security. Very high. Only macros installed in trusted locations are allowed. Everything else is automatically disabled. This means that I must go in and first set myself or any other user that's writing macros as a trusted publisher. Now keep in mind, this is normally a task that's done by your IT administrator. Also, working with trusted sources goes beyond the scope of this course. You may want to look into a security video that will cover these components. Our next method of security, high. Now here, I will run macros from trusted sources, and I will be allowed to run macros from unsigned. The difference, very high, you cannot run a macro if it's not in your trusted source. On high, it's automatically turned off, but I will have the ability to turn it back on. Medium. Medium is what most of us will run. Here we can choose whether or not to run the macro on each spreadsheet. Please be careful though. If you are setting up macros for a number of people within an office, you may want to consider high or very high. As a general rule, most people will say enable macros rather than disable, so we could be running a potentially harmful code on our machine. The last component, and we strongly recommend that you do not use this, will always run all macros no matter where the source. You can see where this becomes very dangerous. Now back to 2007 in the macro security screen. You will once again notice that we have 4 options. The options don't have as much detail. The last selection, enable all macros, is not recommended. Okay, please really think before you turn this option on. I know it makes it very easy to not worry about the macros coming through, but it is quite dangerous. You'll notice disable all macros with notification. This is the second one that we recommend in 2007. The macro will still run, but the default is have it turned off. So if it is turned off, how will I go ahead and actually select it? When you select the second option, you will come to a screen that is a security warning. Notice that this will tell you that the macros could contain a virus. Although it is usually safe to disable, if the macro is legitimate, you won't be able to run it. In other words, if you enable the macro, you can use your macro. If you disable your macro, you cannot utilize it. All versions of Excel will bring you to this security warning when you choose your medium security. That is what we mean by you can choose whether or not to run the potentially unsafe macro. Select medium if you are in 2003 and other legacy versions. You are in 2007, consider disable all macros with notification. Of course, you can choose any one of the settings. This is just simply what we recommend as the safest method of using macros within Excel. Before we begin our discussion of actually creating macros, it's important to talk about the extensions that we now use. Although most of this information is for the newest version of Excel, 2007, please note the add-in module. For those of us using 2003 or legacy versions, the add-in applies to you also. What you may want to keep in mind is that prior versions utilize the .xla extension. We'll talk about that in just a few moments. First, let's talk about what happened to extensions in 2007. When you begin with Excel, you will notice a new format. .xlsx is a normal default file for Excel. The difficulty here with macros is it will not store the macro code. If you simply save a file after creating a macro, that macro is not accessible. That means we'll have to use another extension. We will want to use .xlsm to store a macro. It is the same file as we use for the default, but allows us to enable macros. This change has been instituted for the purpose of security. When you're saving the file, you will notice the differences in the Save As section. Let's go up to the Office button, down to Save As. When going into Save As, you'll notice Macro Enabled Workbook. When I go into a macro-enabled workbook, this is where the actual extension will change. Notice we have a normal workbook, a macro-enabled workbook, and of course if we go down, we will see all the 97 to 2003 templates. When you actually go into your file system or the Windows directory, you will now see XLSM for macro, XLSX for excluding macros. As we continue, you will notice the same changes for templates. If I am saving a template without macros, I will use XLTX for excluding macro. I will use XLTM for containing macro. In the prior versions of Excel, we would simply use XLS or XLT. They would both include and exclude those macros. We did not have a choice. Now for those of you that were going to be going fairly deep into working with macros, and if you have very significant data that tends to slow down, we have an extension that is called an XLSB. B is for binary. This is a special extension that will be a fast load and save. It's used in those instances where we have quite a bit of data that we're switching back and forth from a mainframe program. For most of us, we'll never use this extension. Finally, the add-in extension. Now again, in 2007, we will need to put the M afterwards, M for an actual macro. Keep in mind that in prior versions, we also use this extension of XLA. When we're creating macros, the macro only runs in the workbook that we're issuing, or we'll have to have this workbook opened. If we want our macro to be available to everyone without having to open that workbook each time, we can save that file as an add-in. When we use that add-in, we can then load it on everyone's machine, and the macro will work everywhere we go. In order to do that, though, we must use a special extension in Excel. XLA for legacy versions, XLAM for 2007. When you're working with each of these extensions, please keep in mind that it'll make a very big difference as to whether or not you will be able to run your macro within Excel. When a macro is not running properly, the first thing to do is always go back into Windows, check what your extension is. If your extension is incorrect, simply resave it. Now do remember, if you use the default extension, you will most probably have to repeat your macro and create it again from scratch. So it's very important to get in the habit of checking those extensions.